I will launch into my official introduction. So welcome to Chebacco Chats, Season 4, Episode 8. I'm Jenna Jondro, Communications and Engagement Manager at MDI Historical Society, and your host today. Season 4 of Chebacco Chats is sponsored by Machias Savings Bank. We are grateful for their continued support of our exhibits and programs. Chebacco Chats uses a webinar format. So while you can see and hear us, we cannot see and hear our audience. We do invite you to ask questions and send comments using the chat feature at the bottom of your Zoom screens. When you use the chat feature, you have the option to send a message to the host and panelists or to everyone, and that will include people in the audience. Today, we have a special episode of Chebacco Chats. I'm speaking to Jeri Bowers, David Evans, and Dr. Hermann Haller of MDI Biological Laboratory. Jeri Bowers joined the MDI Biological Laboratory in 1999 as the Director of Development and Public Affairs, responsible for all fundraising, communications, and government relations activities for the institution. David Evans is former director of the MDI Biological Laboratory and the author of Marine Physiology Down East, the story of the Mount Desert Island Biological Laboratory. Dr. Hermann Haller is president of MDI Biological Laboratory, along with professor and director of the Department of Nephrology and Hypertension, Hanover Medical School. Thank you all for being here. It is a real pleasure to be with you. Today, we are going to be talking about a very special year for your organization, 125 years of existence. So congratulations to all of you. And thank you for being here to tell us a little bit about the history of this century and a quarter. So thanks again for being here. And Jeri, I am going to pass the mic on to you first to kick us off into this special episode.
Well, that's wonderful. Jenna, thank you so much. We're thrilled to be here with you and just really appreciate the opportunity to tell your audience a little bit more, maybe a little bit more than they already know about the MDI Biological Laboratory. And I am thrilled to have the two experts with me today to help tell that story. So Dr. David Evans, as you mentioned in your intro, is our unofficial, maybe our official, I don't know, maybe we need to give him that official title as the MDI Biological Laboratory historian. And he has just done a fantastic job of really combing through 125 years worth of documentation and history and helping us, those of us who are a little more recent to the organization, maybe tell that story in an articulate way. So we're excited. This, as you mentioned, is our anniversary year. So we have a whole series of opportunities lined up to kind of tell that story a little bit more. And we're excited to do that, and actually really excited to have kind of our first attempt at doing that this evening with your audience. And Dr. Haller, as you mentioned, is the president of the lab and someone who also has a great perspective on really, I think, the impact that the research that's been done at MDIBL over that century and a quarter, kind of the impact that has on medicine today. So I'm thrilled to have them with me. And, you know, as we kick this off, Jenna, I thought it might be helpful because my guess is your audience is fairly familiar with the story of, you know, George Dorr and how he was very instrumental in bringing the MDI Biological Laboratory to Mount Desert Island. But what I hope we could talk a little bit about today is some of the historical context of that move. Sort of why did that happen? What was happening at the time? You know, where was science at the time and why were people interested? And then maybe get into a few of the folks who really had a major impact in building the reputation of the MDI Biological Laboratory and some of those kind of scientific milestones that we tend to talk about and incorporate. And then we just want to wrap up with a little glimpse at what the lab is doing today, because we're pretty excited about, I think, how well we've kind of maybe stayed connected to that original vision that Dorr laid out, this idea of a research station, a place where scientists from all over the world could come, connect with nature, study nature, and learn from that and apply it to human health. So I think we stick pretty close to that original vision today, and we're really excited about what the future holds. So with that, I just want to kind of jump in and talk a little bit with Drs. Evans and Haller about kind of that historical context, right? So the MDI Biological Laboratory was originally formed in 1898, and it was formed as a summer school for Tufts College, for biology students from Tufts College. And so David knows this history much better than I, but you know, if you think about what was happening at the time, Darwin had published Origin of Species in, I think, 1859. And there was this, you know, that was a pretty radical concept for the day, right? So people really were, for the first time, maybe challenging this idea of divine creation, right? They wanted to maybe better understand this idea of natural selection. What did that mean? And how were we connected to that natural world? But David and Hermann, I don't know if you have, you know, thoughts about sort of, you know, the general feeling of where science was at that time and how marine research sort of played an important role in helping fill out that tree of life. I mean, do you have thoughts about that?
Well, actually, because I'm German, I think I should start because the German was involved very early on. So after Darwin, animal species from the ocean were used to investigate evolution. A lot of sea animals, and Mr. Dorn, Anton Dorn, a German, had this fabulous idea that one should bring the laboratory to the sea and not the sea animals to the laboratory. So he founded the first role model, our mother institution, in 1871 in Naples, in Italy. It still exists. It's a wonderful Renaissance Renaissance castle, basically, and this is where it started. And the reason why it's so important, because it had all the principles we hold dear. It was international. Scientists from all over the world came to Naples. When they had their 30th birthday, he had a list of more than 300 international scientists, a lot of Americans. It was paid by the different countries. So they got their funding from Harvard, they got their funding from Princeton, they got their funding from Cambridge in England. And so it's really a role model. And then from then on, there were marine biology stations all over the world, and we are one of them. And this is what I wouldn't dare to talk about it because David knows much more about that than I do.
Well, the first thing I would say is that just to remind people, this is the 125th anniversary of our founding. But it's also the 100th anniversary of our naming, because once we moved to the island in the Salisbury Cove in 1921 and 1923, we changed our name to Mount Desert Island Biological Laboratory. So it's really kind of two anniversaries. Mm-hmm. It's difficult to know exactly why so many marine labs started at the same time, but they certainly did. A lot of it, I think, was because people, as Hermann said, wanted to study marine animals. What you should realize is that initially they started just studying marine animals for their own sake. And a lot of those stations were really basically ecological stations where you collected animals, brought them in the laboratory, watched them do things, and dissected them and these things, sort of things. So it was a matter of systematists categorizing the animals, anatomists dissecting them, physiologists trying experiments on them. And that's the way marine biology, it still continues today in many laboratories. What makes our laboratory unique is that starting in the late 1920s, we had an influx of physicians and physiologists from medical schools and maybe PhDs. And so our laboratory then, and continues to be the only marine laboratory that, I shouldn't say continues because it ended about 10 years ago, but really is a laboratory that was set up to study marine animals per se, but also use those marine animals as model systems for physiological functions in humans. So when I was working at the lab in the 1970s to 2010, I would be literally next to, or my laboratory was next to an MD who had an interest in what fish were doing as a model system for what the human kidney was doing, where I cared about fish kidneys or fish gills per se. And no other place in the world has this MD PhD connection where they could help me with my research in terms of its application to human disease, and I could help them understand what the best animal to use was, how to approach their questions using marine animals. It was a very, very unique place. Now, we've changed that in the last few years for lots of reasons we don't need to get into, but that's what made the MDIBL so unique. On the coast, using local animals for really studies of fundamental processes in cells and also in animals themselves with MDs and PhDs.
That's fantastic.
If I may add, we're still like that. Now, what David just described, and it took us a couple of years over the last years, but we are doing basic research, which is this wonderful thing where you look at animals, where you look at organs, where you look at cells and mechanisms, just to try understand how the world and biology functions. But at the same time, we are trying to use our animal species for biomedical research, for pharmaceutical development, and we are the only thing which is different from the old times is that we have to be very clear. Is this biomedical research or is this basic research? Because you can't do both at the same time, but you have to discuss it all the time. So that's for me important to add, because it explains why we are such a wonderful place for basic research, and a lot of international scientists come to us because of that. But at the same time, we have now a very strong basis for doing biomedical research and drug development.
Mm. So let's just go back a little bit to, kind of the history and talking about that sort of late 19th century era where there was this real interest in, David, as you said, even just identifying species, right? I mean, I think at that point they were still, really interested in this area in particular, because as I understand it, the formation of the what became the MDI Biological Laboratory was really the first marine station, or maybe the only marine station north of Casco Bay. Is that right? That this was a particularly prime opportunity because it represented an area that had yet to really be fully explored.
Exactly, and the water was much clearer, much cleaner. Casco Bay was getting not polluted, but they were very near to Portland, and so they were worried about that. Plus, a lot of the move was predicated on I think the potential for fundraising, quote unquote, for what we now call development in Bar Harbor versus Harpswell. I think it was as simple as that. They had connections to Bar Harbor, and they realized that this may be easier to maintain a laboratory there. So there were good scientific reasons, but there really were good developmental reasons too, because they needed to have a funding base. Because in those days there were no NSF or NIH grants. There's no federal funding of research. And that was true for the first half of our life up in Maine, up in Salisbury Cove. It wasn't until the late 1950s or 1960s that we could get federal grants and grants from pharmaceutical companies to support the research.
Yeah, exactly.
And that made a huge difference, needless to say.
Right. I think, at the time, I mean, both, kind of arts and sciences did have benefactors, right? Long before the federal government was really engaged in that. So, in thinking about kind of what was happening here on Mount Desert Island around that time, I mean, Jenna and the folks at the Historical Society are much more clear on this than I am, but, we had the Champlain Society, right? So Charles Eliot and his son were here exploring. I think that was around 1870. Is that right? 1880, maybe? I don't know exactly the date, but, that ethos, that idea of getting out there and exploring and, keeping journals and documenting what you were seeing. I mean, that was something that I think really was pervasive at that time. That's part of why they wanted to come to Mount Desert Island, was to kind of do meaningful, engage in meaningful activities, maybe away from the sort of typical social set of Newport and other things of the day. Seems like. Seems
Right.
like, yeah. I mean, like that it really led to this idea, or this, maybe partly led to Doerr's interest in pursuing that. And I know we have great examples of, correspondence between members of the Wild Gardens of Acadia as they're talking about how to, or their interest, in potentially recruiting a science organization or a research institution to Mount Desert Island. And I think, David, that was somewhat focused around honoring a friend and colleague, right? Was this what they wanted to recognize Weir Mitchell? Is that
Yeah, I think so. Although I looked in the archives when they used to be in the old building down on Ledgelawn Street and Ledgelawn Avenue. And I never found any direct correspondence between Weir Mitchell and Doerr, although there must have been, because they certainly knew each other. They were members of high society at that point. Mitchell is a very fascinating person who doesn't really have a direct connection with the lab other than his name.
Mhm.
Mitchell was a Civil War surgeon, became the father really of behavioral neurology. And there's a funny story about him because he treated women oftentimes postmenopausal, I guess, and he had a woman who was lying in bed and would not get up, and I shouldn't really say this, but he threatened to take his pants off if she wouldn't get up, and she did. This is well documented in all the writings about, that's her favorite story about Weir Mitchell. Anyway, so Mitchell became very famous because he founded the American Physiological Society, one of 4 people who did that. He was the man who brought, I'm going blank now, the famous medical person at Johns Hopkins who started Johns Hopkins, William Osler. He brought William Osler from Canada to University of Pennsylvania, which is where he first started. And he's memorialized, you may not realize this, in a bust that sits in the Jessup Laboratory, the Jessup Library. Our MDIBL also has a similar bust. It's God knows where it is. It's someplace in our background, but that bust used to sit in the entrance. Now it's in a corner in the reading room to the right. And that's where Mitchell, and he was there. He's there because he spoke at the dedication in 1911 of the library. He was a good friend of Morris Jessup, who was president of the American Museum of Natural History. So there was a connection there. Mitchell died about in 1914. To honor him, when the Wild Gardens of Acadia purchased the land in Salisbury Cove, they called it the Weir Mitchell Tract. And so when our laboratory moved, when the Tufts University Marine Laboratory, also called the Harpswell Lab, moved up to Salisbury Cove, it was called the Mitchell Station of the Tufts University Marine Laboratory. And it was called that until 1923, when it changed its name.
That's great. I have a couple of images, just, I don't want people to think we're incredibly low tech. We do have some images here. I wanted to just share, let me just put this out here, but, this I think is a great example of what you were talking about, David, in terms of how, the early work that was being done in South Harpswell at the Tufts or the Harpswell Marine Station. And this really, I think, depicts that kind of cataloging work that was happening, right? They were actually just still trying to identify different species and whatnot. I don't know.
I've always loved their field clothes.
I know.
They were much more formal than we ever were.
I love this one, if I can go back, where the guy's out there on crutches. I mean, that's dedication. He's dropped one crutch in the seaweed. And
The man on the right is Ulrich Dahlgren.
Oh, wow.
At least it looks like him.
Yeah.
So probably was at Harpswell. He's pretty young in those days. He's the man that brought our laboratory from Harpswell up to MDI. He was the first director and the last director basically at Harpswell.
That's amazing. So I'm just going to flip through a couple of these images because I can never quite get my computer to work when I'm trying to do that. This kind of represents that reference that you were making, David, to the Tufts Summer School of Biology and how it was advertised when it was there in South Harpswell. And it kind of gives a little map of the location of where we were. So tell us just a little bit about what that was. It was on Potts Point, is that right, in South Harpswell?
It says that, and that's not it. That's the original place it started for in 1898. And they only lasted a couple of years, and they moved about 1901 down south a little bit further in that figure. You can't really see it. That building, this building is still there, the one that's in the middle. It's now much more modernized, but that was the initial building that they held the classes in. And then a couple of years later, they moved down to, I think it's called, anyway, it's not Potts Point. It's another, I'll think of it and I'll blurt it out in a minute. But and this is at the other point. This is the original building that they built. So that was about 1904 probably.
Okay.
And that building looks a lot like our Neal Laboratory. It's not our Neal Laboratory, which is the first laboratory building they built in 1921 on the coast of Salisbury Cove. Looks very similar, but that was a teaching lab. Do you have the picture of the interior of that laboratory? That's a house now. It still exists. It's a home owned by a young family. When my wife and I went there in 2011 just to sort of look at the place, we walked up to the house and knocked on the door and said, "Yeah, I know this place was a laboratory." And the interior of the house looks exactly like the lab, and it's the same sort of ceiling panels that the laboratory pictures show.
Oh, wow, that's great. I don't actually have that picture in here. I should have put it in.
Well, I'll show the other picture this summer.
Yeah, that sounds great. So let's fast forward a little bit and talk about that connection with Dorr and sort of how the laboratory actually migrated north. Can you tell a little bit about that story and sort of, how that came about?
I'm not very conversant in that. I've read Ron Epps' book. It's not clear to me because there are a couple of letters, and I don't know whether Ulrich Dahlgren contacted Dorr or Dorr was looking around for somebody to bring a laboratory up to what became Acadia National Park. So it's not clear to me exactly how that transpired. All I know is by 1921 they had signed papers for a multi-decade rental of that space or leasing of that space. And then the laboratory, later on, 20, 30 years later, they got the title to the land. So it never has been clear to me. And I kind of hedged that in the book that I wrote, exactly how that happened. So I wish I could tell you more, but I really can't.
No, that's fine. So let's talk a bit about, some of the folks who were here in Salisbury Cove and, there's a long list of people who had, I think, a pretty significant impact, but I just wondered if you and Dr. Haller might, highlight 2 or 3, like who are your favorite, what are the favorite stories that you have about some of the early scientists that were here at the MDI Biolab? Any that pop immediately to mind?
Well, I hate to keep talking all the time. My favorite story is the Lewises. I've always liked the story. The Lewises, and it has nothing to do with these buildings. And these buildings, by the way, are the original building on the left, the right-hand building, which is now the Epstein Lab. No, that's not it's next to the Epstein Lab. This is the kidney, the dog. I'm trying to think of the right word. My wife will yell at me in the other room.
It's the
Kidney shed. Thank you, dear.
Yeah.
That's the kidney shed. Anyway, this was built. The building on the left was built in 1921. By 1924, the building on the right had been built in its twin right to the right of which you can't see. And they've been built by Proctor, and that's a whole other story. The story I want to tell is that the Lewises, who had been at Harpswell about in 1916 and 17, came up in 1924 to MDIBL and worked there for about 40 years. And they rented, their laboratory was what we now call Doyle, which is just across the street and above the post office in Salisbury Cove. It's a small 1860s cottage, gray, needs to be updated, obviously. And they worked there and they did some really important work. And some of their work was on the composition of blood of various species. They were both biologists and really both cell physiologists. And they needed to bleed an eel to get the blood. They needed to get the blood from an eel, and they really couldn't figure out a way to get the eel to hold still to be bled, obviously. And a young chap who happened to be a student in a summer course that was being taught by the then director's wife came by and helped them. And his name was David Rockefeller. He was then very young. This was probably 1928 or something like that. And he showed them how you can basically just drop an eel on the newspaper and it would roll around. And I've done this myself, roll around, and then you just grab the newspaper. And the eel was stuck in the newspaper like a big sausage. And you could bleed the animal that way.
Wow, that's fascinating. So yeah, interesting. Speaking of David Rockefeller and that connection, I was thinking a lot about your comment earlier about benefactors for science, and thinking about some of the benefactors that were really instrumental, in addition to Dorr and others who certainly played an enormous role. But people like Louise de Koven Bowen, right, and being one of the first early trustees of the MDI Biological Laboratory, and supporting, Dr. Neal as being president. And I think in this photo, am I correct that she actually provided a chauffeured car for him as well as a place to live, because she really wanted, to make sure that the director of the lab had all the, I guess.
Right. She was a close friend of the Neals, and basically insisted that they get the cottage, which is a big farmhouse, which is up at the top of the hill in Salisbury Cove, on the left, just before the Rapinian's house is now, just before that road, which goes out to Spruce Point. And there was a beautiful farmhouse there, but it fell in disrepair, and so we had to tear it down. But she insisted they live there, basically rent free, and also have a car. And I think that's the car. I don't know for sure.
Yeah.
I should say that this building on the right, these are, you can't really see, there's really two buildings there, and that again is the kidney shed and Epstein, which is right behind it. And the one you're looking at is not what's called the dark room. These three were built by Proctor in 1924, 1925. He was the dominant researcher at the lab. He was a private investor. He was from the Proctor family, so Procter and Gamble soap, and he was a very good private investigator. Invested a lot of money. His property that he rented from Wild Gardens was just to the west of ours. We now own that property. We got title to it in the late 50s. But he built those three buildings, and what he did was to have most of the scientists at the lab, there were only 5 or 10 at that point, working on a survey of all the animals and plants, insects, invertebrates, mammals, everything of Frenchman Bay as well as MDI.
Fascinating. So one of the questions in the comments is about the kidney shed and that term.
Yeah, that was me. I would like to say, as the host of Chebacco Chats, this is the first time I've ever heard any reference to a Rockefeller eel wrestler and a kidney shed so casually dropped into some history. So this has been fascinating so far for many more reasons than that. But that is me putting in the cheeky comments in the chat.
Hermann can speak to that better than I can, I think.
I don't think so, but kidney is very important. Most people on the island don't know that MDIBL is in the kidney world famous. I mean, really, every kidney doctor in the US has heard, when they are academic, about MDIBL, because this was the place where all our concepts, how the kidney functions, the basic principle. Actually, when you go to your doctor today and he or she measures kidney function, this is based on work at the lab in the 50s and 60s of the last century. So also very nice story. One of the Harvard professors in nephrology comes to the lab. They have two things. They want to take their picture taken in front of the kidney shed, because this is where Homer Smith, who developed all these concepts, world famous. And then they want to go around the corner to Spruce Point, where his cottage is, and they want their picture taken in front of the cottage. And then that's okay. Then they can leave. But this is world famous. And when I was a young student, and you went to the American Society of Nephrology, 8,000 kidney doctors sitting in one room. MDIBL was flickering around the room with all the alumni and with all the buildings and with all the natural beauty. So it's a world famous place for kidney, and this is why it's called the Kidney Shed.
See, the Chamber of Commerce is missing out in promoting this as the world famous kidney location.
That's all very
There's a
true.
whole sector of tourism that we are missing.
There's this website, the whole concept of Atlas Obscura. I really think there needs to be an entry on Atlas Obscura for the Kidney Shed and link it to its really important, significant history medically. So that's great. I'm so glad that you included an image of that from your archives.
You heard it here first. This is
You heard it. Yeah, you heard it here first.
well, that's great. You know, while we've touched on this a little bit, but I want to just talk also a bit about the role of training at MDIBL, because to me, that's one of those themes that really is pervasive throughout the history, you know, from the earliest beginnings as a summer school for Tufts College to, you know, what we do today. And I love, David, in a lot of your work, this idea that there is sort of a lineage at MDIBL, right? This kind of family tree, if you will, of people who came as students, were mentored by scientists here, and then came back as professional scientists on their own. So tell us a little bit about, you know, kind of how that worked and why training was such an important part of what was happening at MDIBL.
Yeah, some of those lineages are 6 or 7 people deep. I mean, it's not really generational. They usually it's 10 or 15 years between each generation. But my lineage goes back to the 1940s at the laboratory with Roy Forrester, who came up to work with basically with Homer Smith's group with Jim Shannon, and then he brought up Leon Goldstein. Leon Goldstein brought me up, but also just suggested I come up. I brought up graduate students who stayed on and they became their own investigators. So that's 5 generations right there. It was very typical. Homer Smith brought up a whole bunch of people that work. Bodel Nielsen was an example. Tom Marion was an example. And then Tom Marion had students who stayed on. So there's this long history of finding the place for various reasons and then liking it so much that you're going to stay forever. And one of my favorite family stories is I was an NSF funded person, which NSF, contrary to NIH, which has 5-year grants, NSF has 2 or 3-year grants, National Science Foundation, because I was a biologist. Still am. So about halfway through, every 2 years, I had to write a grant proposal. My wife, after about 3 or 4, said, well, you know, if you don't get this grant, the boys and I are still going to Maine. You can stay home and write another grant.
No
Luckily,
pressure.
that never happened.
I hope you put that in the application.
Yeah, right.
I think.
You can't hear her in the other room, but I can. She was chiding me. But it was just such a wonderful place to live and such an incredible place to do research. I can't tell you how easy it was to do research there and how communal it was and how interactive it was. And our kids all were raised together and went at the sailing of the Bar Harbor Club together. And there's 3 or 4 generations of kids that did that. We socialized probably more than we should during the weekends, but that was all part of it. And that started with Homer Smith and E.K. Marshall. And so you would talk, you'd be at a cocktail party and you'd talk about science. I mean, it's just a total immersion. People used to call it summer camp in a derogatory way, but I think of it as being a perfect summer camp of science. It was just an extraordinary, and it still is. I think when I go back up in the summer, that feeling of the laboratory is still there, even though they're year-round.
It's very important, excuse me, to keep that. I've been coming here since 1998. I've literally brought and trained more than 70 students and fellows, both clinical and PhDs, more clinical. And I have young medical students now who are the sons and daughters of the researchers who came with me in the early 2000s. And what David just mentioned, there is a spirit about MDIBL which draws people back. Since 1998, I've been coming every summer. My wife tells me, she didn't say, we have to go to Maine. She said, there are other places to go to, but we came back every year. And I trained, as I said, dozens of students, and it's a very special place. And the educational part Jeri just mentioned, we have so many alumni who actually had their first year or first summer, and then they either were hooked for science or they could make an educated decision that was great, but I don't want to do this. And I think that's what the lab is actually for, to train all these students. And David, you were the mentor for lots of young people who had not only a wonderful time, but they learned about science, and then they got an education.
Yeah. Well, I had occasion a couple of years ago to finally go to a nephrologist for medical reasons. That's what happens when you turn 80. And I was sat down with a young woman who's in her middle 30s and who's a nephrologist, and I was telling her what I did, and she said, "Well, I've been to MDIBL. I was in one of the courses up there last summer." So she was in the Beth Israel course, which we teach every summer, and I did not. She wasn't in my cycle, so I didn't see her. But I mean, the MDIBL graduates are just everywhere.
I was
especially nephrology.
I was in the office of the president of the National Institutes of Health a couple of weeks ago, and the acting deputy director right now said to me, "I know MDIBL. I was at a course there." I was like, seriously, that's fantastic. But yeah, wherever you go in that sort of, the science and medical fields, people have been touched by some of the work that happens here, or the courses or education programs, which is a real testament, I think, to to the impact that the lab has had in science. And I see
a very nice story in the chat by Bill about Roy Foster in 1959.
Well, and so Roy really was, he played in a really important role scientifically, David. I was reading a little bit about some of the work that he did. I think he had these sort of landmark research papers that really had an impact.
So referring to the comment he just said was Bill Horner, friend to Chebacco Chats and MDI Historical Society, said in 1959, I was a freshman pre-med at Dartmouth. Professor Roy Forster was lecturing about renal physiology and said that the very foundations of nephrology occurred on a small Maine island using flounder kidneys from Frenchman's Bay. I, of course, knew exactly where that is, and Dr. Forster became my biology major mentor and a good friend. Thank you, Bill, for sharing that.
Great.
That's a great story.
Yeah, it is. So,
and it again shares that great wide impact.
Yeah, exactly. And that's sort of the generational piece too, right? And the impact that has. I want to just touch for a minute before we wrap up, because I realize we're coming close to our time. But Bill in his story references flounder kidneys, and I want to just talk a little bit about this idea of comparative biology, right? Like, why is that important? How does that connect? If you think about Dorr and his vision that he wanted to create a place where scientists would come and they would study, in his words, a fresh field of life, right? So that they would look at the natural world and understand it. To me, it's one of the things that is unique about the MDI Biological Laboratory, this amazing sort of legacy of studying so many different organisms in an effort to understand them, on their own, but also to learn lessons or to learn from them in terms of ways that we might impact or improve human health. And I'm just curious, can you tell us a little bit about, why is that? How does that continue today? What are the advantages that you see of comparative, that comparative approach?
Hermann, you want to take that one?
Yeah, coming back to kidney, but in other areas as well. When you look at these different animal species and you compare them, you learn a lot about what's actually important. So 2 hours ago, we had a seminar talking about our salamanders we have as animal models here. And we were looking at metamorphosis. So these salamanders can go from the water and leave the water. That has been, and then they have changes in all the organs and the skin. They look differently. Their body composition is different. And this has been a topic at the lab forever. Homer Smith was using lungfish, and he was working on other animal species. And Bodil Schmidt-Nielsen, famous for the spring desert mouse. You know, these animals provide you with questions like, when you're a mouse in the desert, you only pee 1 ml per year. How does this work? And this explains a lot then about acute renal failure, preservation of water. And these are the areas and the topics which we research on at MDIBL. And still in the old tradition, we use different animal species. And this also, just to add one more, you have to communicate. You have to talk about your research. And I think that's a great experience for students as well, that they learn by osmosis. I mean, you're here on campus and lots of seminars in the dining hall, you still rub shoulders with other researchers. And this is what the MDIBL community is all about.
That's
So I
great.
could just add one thing, that what Herman's talking about is what's called the August Krogh principle. The idea that for any given question, there must be an animal species that would be most readily used to answer that question. August Krogh was a very famous Danish physiologist who got the Nobel Prize in 1921. And his daughter was Bodil Schmidt-Nielsen, who many of you, I'm sure, remember, although she passed away about 10 years ago, but she was at the bio lab for 40 years, brought up by Homer Smith.
Mm-hmm. That's fantastic. So Jenna in the chat mentions this idea of biomimicry, right? This idea of learning from nature, you know, looking for solutions in nature. And it strikes me, Dr. Haller, that you know, much of the work that the lab is doing today is really, again, utilizing this idea of comparative biology. So in studying regeneration and aging, right, it's important to be able to study regeneration in an organism that actually is able to do it. And I'm just wondering, can you talk a little bit about some of the models that we're using today, like the African turquoise killifish, why that's helpful, and the axolotl? What are we learning from those species?
If I have 2 minutes for the African turquoise killifish, nobody can actually pronounce that. But that's the question is aging. Do we understand aging? So this fish comes from Africa, and they have adapted to this short period where there is water. So their lifespan is 7 months. And they age during the 7 months. So they have adapted, and now we have a model of aging where we can study mechanisms of aging in these fish at the lab. We can add things to the water to make them live longer. We can try to understand how their blood vessels are, bone structure. We can even look at kidney function in these fish. So this is why we use different animal species to ask very specific questions. Our neighbors, the Czechs, they make genetic animals, and we do this as well, but mostly we compare the existing animal species, and this is what makes it so valuable. In addition, we are using now methods which are very advanced. We have one of the best microscopy labs on the East Coast at MDIBL. So this is something people don't realize. You pass by on Route 3 and you don't realize that down there is really one of the outstanding laboratories in the state and on the East Coast.
So I noticed a couple of comments in the chat, one from Dr. Leiter and others about, they're actually, you know, really closely aligned. So Dr. Leiter is asking about, you know, changes in the Gulf of Maine, whether or not that's impacting MDIBL's ability to sort of provide experimental marine models for investigators. And the truth is, about 10 years ago, MDIBL moved away from marine species, and largely because with our focus on regeneration and aging, we needed species that were able to reproduce in captivity, right, in our animal facilities. And that was pretty difficult to do with dogfish shark. I know that, the gestation period is 2 years for those animals. So for practical reasons, we started using a lot of zebrafish. We use the axolotl, which is a Mexican salamander that regenerates. We use C. elegans, tiny little microscopic worms that are about, a millimeter in width. So, and now the African turquoise killifish is a model that our scientists are using. So again, still really dedicated to studying organisms in nature, but now ones that are a little smaller and a little easier to house for our scientists. So let's see, there's another one. Dr. Howell, I'm going to throw this one at you. Does the MDIBL ever coordinate with Jackson Lab on genetic factors?
Yes, we do. I mean, it's not known that much, and we should have more meetings together. But for instance, for kidney, the JAX has now a big kidney group, Ron Corsancha. We meet regularly. We are 30 people on this island, all working on kidney between the JAX and us. So that's one, I'm not exaggerating, that's one of the largest kidney research groups I know. You would have a hard time finding 30 people coming together in Boston. And then I think the next one, David, is for you. Can you, David Karnofsky, does that ring a bell?
Oh, sure does.
Sure does. Can you tell a little bit about his work?
Yeah, Karnofsky came up. He may have come up. He probably came up with Smith in the 1940s. I need to look that up. I just wrote about it and forgot again. But Karnofsky came up in the 40s and worked with Smith. Smith had actually worked with Marshall as an enlisted man in the First World War on mustard gases and various poisonous gases, which it turns out have direct effects on different cells. In fact, derivatives of that are now used for chemotherapy, and or at least were. And David Karnofsky came up in the 40s with Smith and stayed into the 60s, and became, if my memory is correct, he became sort of the father of multi-drug chemotherapy. Is that correct? It's been a while since I wrote that and read it in my book. And that was a big step forward. And he probably was in the lab for 10 years, and important enough so that his friends, and I think we also had a grant, built a building called the Karnofsky Laboratory. It's still called Karnofsky Lab, which is the first one you come to on the left as you come down the lab road. His children, pretty typical of that generation, his children stayed in Bar Harbor. We all know them. And many people in that generation, their children just said, we're staying. And you may go to Boston and an old people's home, but we're staying in Bar Harbor. And so it's pretty cool. And they've stayed.
And
there's a lot of Karnofskys around.
My research group worked in Karnofsky for 15 years.
Yeah. That's great. And that's, if I have one regret about tonight, is that there are so many really powerful stories about scientists who spent time at MDIBL over the years, and the amazing research that that work led to in terms of actual therapies that we use today. And I want to just take a moment to kind of promo some of the activities that we have planned this summer as we mark this milestone year. One of them is a lecture where Dr. Evans will have a chance to talk a little bit more about some of those luminaries that were at the lab over the last 125 years. So that will be on July 24th. That's a Monday evening. And that will kick off sort of a week long of celebration and opportunities for folks to engage. All those events are on our website under the events tab. So feel free to log on mdibl.org and check it out. You can register now, and we would love to see you. And we'll be having other community-wide events. I think we have a big family science night planned for July 13th, and that will kind of be just a big community birthday party where we take a moment to celebrate that, and we're just looking forward to telling more of these stories and having an opportunity to share some of what we're so excited about and proud of here at the MDIBL with all of you. So appreciate that opportunity. I do have one kind of fun parting image, Jenna, if you would indulge me. Is that okay? Do we have a second? So, often when I'm talking with our scientists and seeing some of the amazing images, Dr. Haller mentioned, this microscopy that we have and how incredible it is. And I often think about what in the world would scientists that were here, 100 years ago, 125 years ago, think about some of our capability to see inside organisms. I'm not sure. I hope you can see this.
Inside the brain.
You narrate it, Dr. Haller.
But that's, if you can start that's looking with our newest microscope inside the brain. Every tiny dot you see there, if it works.
Is it working? Are you seeing it? It's working on my screen, but maybe it's not on yours.
You have to expand to the whole screen.
Oh, hold on. Let me see how I can do that.
It's still small.
Okay.
It's running, but it's not full screen. You have to do something about it.
Interesting, because it's full screen on mine, so I'm not
Yeah,
sure.
Jean says it's full screen on hers too.
Oh, weird. Okay, well, I'm going to go back then, and we'll try it one more time.
You're flying. If you can run it again. So this is a mouse brain. Every tiny dot you see there is a neuron, and you're flying through the brain. You can do this in 3D. So this gives you an impression how powerful how powerful our microscopes are, and the questions we can ask and the answers we get are just mind-boggling.
So that's just a little teaser for you all to join us this summer. We are going to have an art and science exhibit where we're going to talk a little bit about representation of science and visually, how do we see that? So we're excited to share some of the beautiful images that our scientists are creating, and have an opportunity to sort of juxtapose that with some more contemporary artwork and talk a little bit about art and science. So anyway, lots of fun things planned.
I think you did an excellent job of giving us just enough that we want to go to all of the events that you have this summer, all of them. And to make a couple of comments, I think that to drive down any of the roads on that island and look down a driveway, you probably won't understand the amount of history that's down that driveway. And I'm so glad that we got a glimpse into what's down that road and beyond that sign on Route 3, because it's very impressive. And I thank you for sharing some of that history, and also for your good work, because when the doctor was talking about the kidney group, the kidney research group, I was a little like moved by that. It's like there are 30 people that care about our kidneys all getting together and in community. That's really great and encouraging, of course. So I thank you for not only being here, but also for the good work that you do. David, I was looking at your book. You are an incredible historian. As somebody, I think Ron Epp said in the comments, he complimented you on your historical accuracy. And I think that you've done a fantastic job capturing this organization's storied past. There it is.
There's
Look
the
at
book
that.
that your dog
Oh yeah, that's Ron Epp's book.
It's Ron's
And
book, yeah.
we did have a comment about if you want to learn a little bit more about George Dorr and the MDIBL, that's covered in Ron Epp's biography of George Dorr, I believe was the comment. So unless you have any other parting thoughts, I just want to thank you for being here today and sharing some of your stories about these great scientists and the great century and a quarter of what you've been doing down on the seashore.
Jenna, thank you so much for the opportunity. It was great to be with you, and I appreciate my co-host here helping me through it. So it was great.
Yes, this was very fun. This was very fun. Thanks again. And everybody keep an eye out in the Islander, I'm sure, and all of those Facebook. I know that the MDIBL is on social media. So check out some of those events this summer. Well, they'll be talking about a little bit more of this history.
Absolutely.
So Coming up next week on Chebacco Chats, Thursday, April 27 at 4:30 p.m., our last episode of this spring, Rainy Bench of MDI Historical Society will host Willie Branston of the Great Harbor Maritime Museum to talk about the collaborative process of putting together Chebacco, the Maritime Edition. Chebacco Chats are available to view on our website the week after they air. You can also subscribe to our YouTube channel at MDI History to be notified when we upload them. We are currently seeking feedback on this web series for one more week, so please visit our Chebacco Chats page and take the survey. Just a few minutes, and we'd really appreciate that. The new Chebacco will be delivered to members' mailboxes in a week or so. You can become a member or renew your membership by visiting our website, mdihistory.org. Jeri extends her thank you to everyone for being here, and I will do the same. Have a good night, everyone. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.